What if the greatest mystery of the ancient world wasn't a myth, but a buried truth? What if a long-lost people who shook empires to their knees never truly vanished, but became part of us? The year is 1200 BCE. In the dying twilight of the Bronze Age, the world as it was begins to fall apart. Great cities, Mycenae, Hattusa, Ugarit, are reduced to rubble. The intricate web of diplomacy and trade that once connected the eastern Mediterranean dissolves overnight, and no one truly knows why. Except, in the ruins, there are whispers. In Egypt, carved deep into the walls of the mortuary temple of Ramesses III, the pharaoh scribes tell of a terrible enemy. Not one kingdom, not one army, but a confederation of sea-born invaders. Strange warriors from distant lands, arriving with their families, their carts, their cattle, and their fire. These were not mere raiders. They were nations on the move. They came from the sea. They attacked by sea. They were remembered as the Sea Peoples. Among them were names that would echo through ancient memory: Shurden, Shikalesh, Jeker, Danyan, and the Peleset. It is the Peleset who would settle the southern coast of Canaan, remembered forever as the Philistines. They fought the early Israelites. They built cities like Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron, and for over a century, their culture burned bright and foreign. But no one knew exactly who they were. Not really. The Egyptians said only that they came from the islands. Scholars speculated. Were they Greeks fleeing the collapse of Mycenae? Sardinians? Anatolian refugees? Pirates? Migrants? For thousands of years, the question remained buried, lost to the silence of time. But time does not hold its secrets forever. In the quiet coastal ruins of Ashkelon, Israel, a team of archaeologists began digging beneath the remains of Philistine homes. And there, under the foundations, they found what no one expected: the tiny bones of infants, buried directly beneath the living spaces. Not in formal graves, not in elite tombs, but quietly, intimately, perhaps lovingly, beneath the floors of homes where life went on. The bones were over 3,000 years old, the very beginning of the Iron Age, the very moment the Philistines are believed to have arrived. And inside those fragile remains was the key to a forgotten migration. Scientists from the Max Planck Institute, using the most advanced ancient DNA techniques available, extracted genetic material from the densest bones, the petrous part of the skull, deep in the ear. Despite the brutal climate of the Levant, they succeeded. They sequenced full genomes. And what they found was astonishing. These infants, Philistines buried by Philistines, carried a genetic signal never before seen in the southern Levant. A trace of southern Europe. Ancestry that linked them not to Canaan, but to somewhere far beyond the sea. Crete, Sardinia, the Aegean, the very islands spoken of in the ancient Egyptian records. They had come by ship. Not just warriors, but families. They were real. And they were different. This wasn't cultural imitation. It wasn't trade. It wasn't fashion. It was people, bringing their children, their animals, their bloodlines, to a new world. For the first time in history, we weren't just guessing. We had proof. And yet, this proof came in a whisper. A brief signal. A ghostly imprint. Because what makes the Sea People's DNA so eerie is not just its origin. It's how quickly it disappears. Just 2 centuries later, the genetic record shows almost no trace of this European heritage. The unique DNA that marked these infants, these newcomers, had already begun to vanish, washed away in the sea of local intermarriage, merged with the Canaanite majority, dissolved like salt in water. They were foreigners for a moment, and then they weren't. And that brings us to the haunting question at the core of this mystery. Can a people vanish genetically, yet remain alive in memory? Can blood forget, while stories remember? The Sea Peoples didn't build pyramids or write epic poetry, but their ships brought change, collapse, rebirth, and even in their silence they spoke. Because now, thanks to the bones buried under Ashkelon, their journey can be heard. This was the beginning, the flicker of identity before assimilation, a unique DNA signal from across the sea, carried by the children of invaders whose names are now etched only on temple walls. What if that's how all migrations begin? With a flash of foreign blood and a long echo of memory? If this left you wondering what secrets still lie hidden in ancient genomes, subscribe, because this is only the beginning. And tell us in the comments, if the Sea Peoples dissolved so quickly, how many other lost civilizations are still alive, hidden inside us? You're standing in a city that doesn't know it's about to die. The sun sets on a palace. The harbor is quiet. And just beyond the horizon, black sails rise like omens. It's not an army. It's a storm. And no one in Ugarit or Hattusa or Mycenae, not even Pharaoh Ramesses III, truly understands what's coming. They arrive without warning. No messengers. No declarations. Just fire. Stone walls melt under flame. Temples are crushed. Grain stores stolen. The Sea Peoples don't ask for territory. They take the future. But who were they? How did dozens of cities, from Greece to Syria, fall to a group no one had even heard of before? Egypt called them those who came from the sea. But what kind of people bring wives and children in ox carts to a war? That's the chilling part. This wasn't just conquest. It was migration. And it wasn't random. The names still survive, etched in hieroglyphs. Peleset, Shikalesh, Denyen, Shurden, Jeker, Teresh. But names aren't origins. And back then, even Pharaoh didn't know where they came from. He just knew they had to be stopped. He tried. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu show it in brutal detail. Ship-to-ship combat, spear against shield. Ramesses III throws everything at them. The Nile Delta becomes a graveyard for invaders. Yet not all of them perish. Some were allowed to settle. That was the deal. If they stayed out of Egypt, they could live in Canaan. That's where things get strange. Because in the decades that followed, strange cities began to rise in southern Canaan. Cities with architecture no local tradition could explain. Pottery with Greek-style patterns. Feasting rituals that included pigs, an animal long considered taboo in the region. I remember standing at a dig site in Ashdod once, watching a layer of earth give way to a Philistine house. It had a hearth, benches along the wall, and fragments of pottery that looked straight out of the Aegean. But here's the thing. This wasn't a Mycenaean copy. It was a fusion, a new identity forming in real time. That's when the question hits you. Were these people just copying Aegean styles? Or were they the Aegeans themselves? For years, archaeologists argued. Some said it was cultural diffusion, that these cities, just like the foreign look. Others whispered a wilder theory, that these were refugees from collapsed kingdoms, bringing their entire world with them. But the evidence kept building. The food, the language traces, the burial customs, all unlike anything found in Canaanite towns. This wasn't just a fashion trend. It was a footprint. Still, no one could prove it. Not yet. And then something unexpected happened. Buried beneath one of these cities, scientists found bones. Not just any bones. Infant remains, untouched for millennia. The perfect candidates for ancient DNA. The data they pulled. It cracked the mystery wide open, but that story's coming in the next chapter. What matters here is this. The Sea Peoples were not phantoms. They were not pirates. They were real, structured communities. And they weren't just tearing civilizations down. They were planting themselves in the ruins. But why then? Why all at once? Why did the Mycenaean world collapse, the Hittite Empire vanish, and Egypt nearly fall, just as the Sea Peoples arrived? Coincidence? Or consequence? Was it famine? Earthquakes? The end of bronze trade routes? Or were the Sea Peoples not the cause of the collapse, but the survivors of it? Imagine entire nations swept from their homelands by disaster, natural or human-made, banding together in desperation, sailing east in search of a future. Not raiders, refugees with no way back. And that's what makes them terrifying. Because if the Sea Peoples were the effect, not the cause, then what collapsed the Bronze Age world before them? And if global systems could fall so fast once, what makes us think they can't fall again? That's the question history never stops asking. Are we really so different? Subscribe, because in the next chapter, the story gets personal. DNA speaks. And for the first time, the Sea Peoples aren't just destroying cities. They're becoming part of them. Beneath the floors, beneath the skin. It starts where no one thought to look. Under the floors of a forgotten house. A Philistine home, ordinary in shape, sun-baked and quiet. But just beneath the hearthstone, an infant skeleton. Then another, and another. Not buried in cemeteries. Not laid to rest with ceremony. These were household dead, buried within walls. And somehow, that's where the answers were hiding. It was Ashkelon, a city once feared across the coast, one of 5 Philistine strongholds. And in 2016, a team digging at the heart of its ruins uncovered something that hadn't been seen in over 3,000 years, a full Philistine burial ground. I remember reading the excavation logs. The excitement was real. These weren't shattered fragments. These were intact human stories, waiting to speak. That's where science stepped in. They turned to the petrous bone, the inner ear, one of the few parts of the body where ancient DNA can survive in the punishing heat of the Levant. It's dense, protective. If anything endures, it's there. And it did. Geneticists extracted genomes from infants born during the earliest days of Philistine settlement. Their DNA was compared to people who lived in the same place a century before. And suddenly, a line was drawn, because those children weren't like the ones who came before. They carried something new, a foreign signal buried deep in their genome, a trace of ancestry from thousands of kilometers away. Southern Europe, Aegean shores, perhaps even beyond. Only 10 to 15%, but that was enough. Enough to show that these weren't local Canaanites in new clothes. This was a new people arriving in a land that didn't yet know their name. But what does that really mean? Think about it. A newborn child, wrapped in cloth, buried beneath a home built by people who had just crossed the sea. Her bones contain the imprint of 2 worlds, Levantine and foreign, a fusion of the old and the unknown. That's not mythology. That's data. For years, skeptics claimed Philistine culture was copied, borrowed art styles, imported pottery, culinary imitation. But bones don't imitate. Genes don't lie. These weren't ideas traveling across oceans. These were people. Mothers, fathers, children, carrying not just culture, but bloodlines. And in the DNA, the shift is undeniable. Now here's what makes it even more fascinating. The Bronze Age population of Ashkelon, the Canaanites before the Philistines, had zero trace of this European ancestry. Not a flicker. So when that signal suddenly appears in the early Iron Age, in infants, the conclusion becomes impossible to ignore. New people had arrived. Not many, but enough. But here's the haunting part. The DNA tells us something else too. This change, it doesn't last. Within just 2 or 3 generations, that European ancestry fades. It becomes almost undetectable. By the time we reach the 10th or 9th century BCE, Philistine remains look local again. So what happened? Did the migrants vanish? Or did they simply become something new? We always ask who the sea peoples were. But maybe the better question is, how long does it take for a migrant to become native? And if a people's DNA disappears, does their story disappear too? The Philistines didn't die out. They blended in. They were absorbed, cell by cell, into the Levantine population. Yet their customs survived. Their reputation endured. Their enemies remembered them. The Bible still calls them foreign. So what does that tell us? That culture can outlive blood? That identity isn't written in chromosomes, but in memory? Think of how many times this has happened in history. Groups arrive. They settle. They intermarry. And in a few generations, no one can tell the difference, except in the stories, the habits, the ways of cooking, the names whispered across time. What if that's the real power of ancient DNA? Not just to tell us where people came from, but to show us how fast we change, how quickly the other becomes us. So next time someone asks whether the sea peoples were real, remember this. Their story doesn't live in textbooks or tombs. It lives beneath floorboards, in the bones of babies, in the quiet places where science listens and the past still breathes. If you're still watching, you're part of that journey now. Subscribe, because in the next chapter, we decode what exactly made that DNA so different and why it vanished so fast. And here's what I want to ask you. If you disappeared tomorrow, what would your DNA say about where you came from? And more importantly, what would it leave behind? You can almost picture it. A child running through a courtyard in early Iron Age Ashkelon. The scent of roasted meat in the air, the echo of unfamiliar songs. And yet, This city wasn't quite Philistine, not quite Canaanite. It was something else, something in between. When scientists sequenced the DNA of those early Philistines, they didn't just discover migration. They found a genetic cocktail that had never existed in the Levant before. It wasn't fully European, and it wasn't fully Near Eastern. It was a fusion, a genome caught mid-transformation, a human record of cultural collision. How does something like that even happen? Most ancient populations were surprisingly stable. The people of the Bronze Age Levant had deep local roots, millennia of ancestry tied to farming communities stretching back to the Neolithic. Their DNA was consistent, familiar. But then, around 1200 BCE, something broke the pattern. That's when this unexpected signature shows up, a trace of Southern European blood inside newly arrived Philistines. Not dominant, just enough to make them unmistakably different. Roughly 10 to 15% of their genome pointed west, toward the Mediterranean, not Mesopotamia, toward lands that had themselves collapsed just decades earlier. This was not a simple transplant. It was a hybrid population, a blend of local and foreign, converging at one of the most turbulent moments in human history. And it wasn't just the DNA that changed. Archaeologists noticed something odd. The pottery from early Iron Age Philistine sites didn't just look Mycenaean. It evolved. Over time, it developed unique motifs, spirals, birds, hybrid forms that didn't match anything in Greece or Canaan. Their food ways shifted too. Pork consumption spiked in Philistine settlements, diverging sharply from their Israelite and Canaanite neighbors. Why would a new group so deliberately stand apart? Was it identity? Was it memory? I once spoke to a researcher who described it like this. These people weren't copying the Aegean. They were the Aegean, filtered through loss. Think about that. They'd watched their homelands fall. They'd crossed the sea in desperation. And when they landed, they built a new version of themselves. Something rooted in old traditions, but shaped by entirely new surroundings. They didn't preserve their identity. They reinvented it. And that's what the DNA shows us. Not a clean break, but a merger. A population trying to hold onto something as it faded. But here's where it gets strange. When researchers compared these hybrid Philistines to other regional groups, Israelites in the highlands, Moabites across the Jordan, Egyptians to the south, no one else showed this mix. No one. This was a genetic island. A brief biological experiment that occurred nowhere else on Earth. It's like finding a painting that only existed for a moment. A masterpiece wiped clean within 2 generations. Because, as we now know, by the 10th century BCE, that unique genome starts to disappear. The Southern European signal is drowned out by local Levantine ancestry. But in that narrow window, those 200 years, something completely new existed in the DNA of the Philistines. Something that didn't come from myth or inscription. Something you could measure. Something you could touch. How often does history offer that? The world of ancient DNA is brutal. Most samples degrade. Bones rot. Climates erase what memory tries to preserve. But here, for once, the data survived, and it revealed a population in the middle of becoming. Not immigrants. Not natives. Something in between. And that raises an unsettling question. How many cultures have we misjudged because we assumed identity was binary? Local or foreign? Us or them? But what if identity, like genetics, is always blending? The early Philistines weren't pretending to be Aegean. They were becoming something else entirely. And in doing so, they left behind a fingerprint. One that tells us more about how civilizations evolved than any statue or tablet ever could. What if you could hold a human bone and read a migration in its code? What if you already have? The hybrid shouldn't exist. But it did. And if you're still here, still listening, it's because you know the past isn't black and white. It's layered. It's complicated. It's us. Subscribe, because in the next chapter, we'll see how this short-lived genetic anomaly didn't just disappear. It was overwritten. And the silence that followed is just as important as the signal itself. Imagine discovering something extraordinary, only to watch it disappear right before your eyes. That's what ancient DNA revealed about the Sea Peoples. A sudden, shocking signal, Southern European, foreign, undeniable, flickered into existence around 1200 BC. And then, like breath on glass, that was gone. The early Philistines stood apart. Genetically, They were unmistakable. A blend of Levantine ancestry with something that had crossed the Mediterranean. Not from the east, from the west. But then comes the twist no one expected. That uniqueness didn't last. Within just a few generations, their genetic identity begins to erode. By the 10th century BCE, the foreign DNA is no longer detectable. Not reduced. Not hidden. Gone. How does that happen? We often think of migration as a one-way act. People arrive, establish roots, leave their mark forever. But this was different. The newcomers didn't isolate. They intermarried. They assimilated. And their genetic legacy was overwritten, absorbed into the much larger population they settled among. It's a biological vanishing act. One that leaves behind no monument, no boundary, no scar. Just a brief echo. I remember watching footage from a dig in Ashkelon, the later Iron Age layers. Burial after burial, but genetically, they weren't distinguishable from their Canaanite predecessors. The Philistines were still there, culturally, but their DNA had blended so completely, you couldn't trace it anymore. What does that say about memory? About identity? It means a people can survive in name, in legend, in enemy scripture, while their actual lineage dissolves. This challenges everything we assume about ethnicity. Can you be called foreign long after your DNA says otherwise? The Bible continued to label the Philistines as outsiders for centuries. But by then, they were biologically local, genetically indistinct. They had become the very people they once stood apart from. And yet, their language, their rituals, their architecture, those persisted. So ask yourself, what defines a people? Is it blood? Or the stories they choose to tell? Because here's the reality. If archaeologists hadn't captured that narrow window, those few early Philistine burials, we'd never have known there was ever a migration. We'd have called them Canaanites with strange tastes. The truth would have vanished, like their DNA. This is why timing matters in science. Catch the past too early, and the signal hasn't arrived yet. Catch it too late, and it's already gone. And that makes the Sea Peoples unique. Not because they stayed different, but because they didn't. Most ancient populations carry long-lasting genetic legacies. Slow drifts, gradual admixtures. But this was a flashpoint, a one-time fusion, then silence. You can't help but wonder, how many other ancient migrations were just as brief? How many other peoples arrived, settled, disappeared into the bloodstream of history, their names erased, their origins forgotten, their impact invisible, except to those who know where to look? Philistine culture remained. Their memory lingered. But their bodies? They became Levantine, fully, irrevocably. So next time we talk about lost civilizations, maybe we should remember, not all are lost to war or plague. Some disappear in peace, through marriage, through family, through time. If you're still watching, you're asking the right question. How long does it take to stop being other? Subscribe now, because in the next chapter, we trace how this temporary genetic intrusion reveals something deeper. Not just about who the Sea Peoples were, but how the ancient world kept evolving, even after they were gone. And here's something to think about. If you lived 3,000 years ago, would your DNA survive? Or would you be remembered only by what others said about you? Sometimes, the most human stories are told by things that never speak. A broken tusk, a cracked jawbone, a fragment of hoof buried in ancient soil. Because oddly enough, pigs help confirm the story the Sea Peoples left behind. At first glance, it seems ridiculous. How could animal bones tell us anything about lost civilizations? But science has a way of turning the ordinary into revelation. In the southern Levant, archaeologists had long noted a shift in pig remains during the early Iron Age. Bones became larger, morphology changed, and more importantly, their DNA changed. Suddenly, pig haplotypes that had never been seen in the Near East began appearing. And they didn't just appear, they took over. By the 9th century BCE, the pigs in Philistine territory were mostly European in origin. This wasn't crossbreeding. It was replacement. So what does that tell us? That humans didn't just migrate with children and weapons. They brought animals, livestock, entire agricultural systems. And pigs, stubborn, noisy, hard-to-herd pigs, don't swim across oceans on their own. They were carried. federal protected. That means whoever these people were, they came to stay. This wasn't a raid. It was relocation. Now think about what that implies. It matches perfectly with Egyptian accounts. Those same reliefs that show carts, oxen, women, children. These weren't war bands. They were communities in motion. But pigs are just the beginning. Other lines of evidence began emerging. Pottery styles from Sardinia suddenly show up in eastern Cyprus. Destruction layers in coastal Turkey date to the exact same decades as the fall of Ugarit. Coincidence? Or convergence? Could the Sherden, that mysterious tribe listed among the Sea Peoples, have come from Sardinia? The similarity in names is striking. Sherden, Shardana. The match isn't proof, but it's hard to ignore. Then there's Cyprus, a strategic stepping stone between Greece and the Levant. Archaeologists found unusual burial customs in certain late Bronze Age tombs, practices not seen elsewhere on the island, practices that look suspiciously Aegean. These patterns don't lie. Wherever the Sea Peoples went, they left disruptions, not just of power, but of biology, architecture, animal species, even diet. These aren't the fingerprints of a myth. They're the residue of real migration. I once saw a chart, side-by-side comparisons of pig DNA from the Bronze and Iron Ages. It wasn't subtle. The moment the Philistines appear in the archaeological record, the pigs change. Just like the pottery did. Just like the human genome did. The story aligns, not in theory, but in data. And here's the real kicker. While human DNA tells us about individual ancestry, animal DNA reveals movement on a societal scale. It confirms the scale of migration. You don't import livestock unless you're rebuilding life from the ground up. So this wasn't a group passing through. This was an ecosystem being transplanted. But how far did it reach? We've only sampled Philistine sites in places like Ashkelon. But what about the other Sea Peoples? The Denyen, the Shikalesh, the Jeker? What genetic secrets are still buried under the soil of Crete, or Sicily, or Sardinia? Imagine if one burial site, one intact tooth, could tell us where a warrior was born, what language he spoke, what god his mother prayed to when she packed his food for the voyage east. We're on the edge of that kind of discovery. Every year, new labs, better sequencing, more precise tools. And with every bone, we get closer to mapping the full diaspora of the Sea Peoples. Not as invaders, but as migrants, carriers of memory, survivors of collapse, and just maybe builders of the Iron Age world that came after. Because in the end, it wasn't about war. It was about adaptation, movement, becoming something new, in a place that didn't know your name. So here's what I ask you. If your ancestors crossed oceans in desperation, would they be remembered as raiders or as founders? Subscribe now, because this mystery isn't over. It's expanding. And the next time archaeologists find pig bones in a shattered city, it might just rewrite everything we thought we knew about who built the ancient Mediterranean.